Sandra Bullock stepped into the grand hall, her simple gray dress a quiet rebellion against the glittering extravagance around her. The air was thick with judgment, masked behind polite smiles and champagne flutes. In a discreet corner, two women whispered behind their glasses. "Look at that outfit. How embarrassing," one sneered. "This is a gala, not a corner diner," the other scoffed. They thought she didn't belong. They had no idea who they were mocking. Sandra wasn't just another guest. She was the night's lead donor and a close friend of Keanu Reeves, the event's organizer. And soon, they would regret every word. Because when Keanu made his move, their world would shift. And Sandra? Her response would be words they would never forget. Before the big reveal, tell us where you're watching from. And if you love stories like this, subscribe, because tomorrow, we have something even better. The grand ballroom was illuminated by hundreds of dazzling chandeliers, reflecting the luxurious excess of the evening. The air carried a mix of expensive perfumes and the crisp scent of bubbling champagne, served by waiters in immaculate uniforms. The charity gala was one of the most anticipated events of the year, bringing together Hollywood's elite, business moguls, and high society figures. Women in shimmering gowns and diamond necklaces glided through the crowd, engaging in carefully measured conversations with impeccably dressed executives. At the entrance, a glowing red carpet stretched under the flashing cameras, capturing every moment as high-profile guests arrived in luxury vehicles. And then she arrived. Sandra Bullock stepped out of a modest, unassuming car. No entourage, no bodyguards making a show of her arrival. She wore a simple yet elegant gray dress. No extravagant jewelry, no excessive shimmer. Her hair was styled in a neat updo, and her makeup was minimal, accentuating her natural beauty. She walked the red carpet without the need to demand attention. Her charisma was effortless, requiring no ostentation. Photographers took a few pictures, but their focus quickly shifted to the next arrivals. Two women stepping out of a sleek black limousine, dressed in dazzling gold gowns with oversized diamond jewelry. They were Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian St. James, known not only for their immense wealth, but also for their sharp tongues and judgmental glances. As they passed Sandra, they didn't bother hiding their evaluating, disapproving stares. And then came the first whisper. Sandra entered the ballroom and felt the weight of the glances. They weren't stares of admiration or curiosity. They were judgmental. She knew she didn't match the expected look for the evening. Here, appearances were a silent currency, and she wasn't spending enough. She ignored it, reminding herself why she was here, to support an important cause, to help raise funds for at-risk children. But as she reached for a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, she overheard something that made her pause. Per Sandra, did no one tell her this is a gala, not a casual dinner? The voice belonged to Eleanor Cartwright. Her tone was sweet but dripping with poison. Vivian, standing beside her, smiled with mock sympathy. I do admire her effort, really, but some people just don't understand what it means to be in this kind of environment. Sandra felt her stomach tighten. She wasn't naive, she knew that some circles revolved around superficiality. But hearing them speak as if she weren't even there, that was something else. She didn't react. She simply took a sip of her champagne and walked away. But the night was just beginning. As Sandra moved through the ballroom, engaging in polite conversation, she noticed a pattern. The most powerful and influential guests seemed indifferent to her presence, not because they disliked her as an actress, but because, in the unspoken social hierarchy of the evening, she didn't appear important enough. She felt a brief pang of discomfort but held her composure. I'm here for the cause, she reminded herself. That was when a waiter passed by and discreetly murmured, Excuse me, Miss Bullock, but your seating arrangement has been changed. She frowned. Changed? To where? The waiter hesitated. To a secondary table. For a moment, Sandra felt the weight of it. She hadn't just been ignored, she had been deliberately pushed aside. And she knew who was behind it. From across the room, Eleanor and Vivian exchanged satisfied glances. Sandra took a deep breath and walked toward her new seating arrangement. It was far from the main stage, where the most influential guests sat, almost a social exile. But before she took her seat, she noticed something. Eleanor and Vivian were watching her, waiting to see if she would react. Sandra offered them a soft, knowing smile and gracefully took her seat. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing any sign of defeat. But she knew this night was far from over. Sandra tried to focus on the event, listening to speeches and watching presentations about the charity's mission. But then she noticed something odd. Eleanor and Vivian were whispering excitedly. Something had caught their attention. Curious, Sandra subtly shifted her position to listen. That was when she heard a familiar name. Keanu Reeves, Vivian said in a conspiratorial tone. Sandra frowned slightly. What does Keanu have to do with any of this? Eleanor chuckled softly. Oh, he has a special surprise planned for tonight. I think Sandra will love it. Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. The way they spoke didn't make it sound like it was a good surprise. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but her heart had started to race. What was happening at this event? Sandra noticed the malicious glances and whispers between the two influential women, sparking concern about their true intentions. The ballroom was alive with energy. Guests were finally settling into their seats while waiters moved smoothly between tables, serving exquisite dishes and filling crystal glasses with the finest wine. Sandra already knew exactly who the host of the night was: Keanu Reeves. The charity gala was one of his most significant philanthropic projects, and he had invited her personally. He assured her that her presence mattered. That's why, when she realized that her assigned seat had been moved to a less prominent location, her surprise was mixed with disappointment. There was no way Keanu knew about this. Or did he? As Sandra settled into her new table, she became aware that the whispers had not stopped. It wasn't just the glances, it was the words. Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian St. James were at the center of it all. Sandra knew that these women thrived on status, and in their world, not displaying enough wealth was already a reason for exclusion. Eleanor's voice rang out across the ballroom, coated in false surprise and amusement. Funny how this event brings together all sorts of people, don't you think, Vivian? The woman beside her smirked, playing along. Oh, absolutely. Some people may think they belong here just because they were invited. But being invited doesn't mean you actually fit in. Sandra held her wine glass steady, feeling a slow burn in her chest. She knew they were talking about her. But what bothered her wasn't the insult. It was the fact that no one seemed to care. Sandra tried to ignore the remarks, but what started as subtle discomfort quickly escalated. The most influential guest avoided interacting with her. Some greeted her with a forced smile, while others pretended not to see her at all. She couldn't believe this was happening at Keanu's event. She had known him for years. She knew how much he valued purpose over appearance. So why was she being treated like she didn't belong? As the main course was being served, a waiter approached and discreetly placed a folded note beside Sandra. She opened it and read the handwritten words. Sandra, darling, I hope you're enjoying yourself. If you ever need a proper dress for next year's event, I know some wonderful stylists. Kisses, Eleanor. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just a passive-aggressive remark. It was a direct attack, delivered in front of everyone. Sandra took a deep breath. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. But now she was certain something bigger was happening, and she needed to find out what. She wasn't leaving, but she needed a moment away to keep her emotions in check. She excused herself discreetly and stepped outside to the garden. She took a sip of champagne and tried to process the situation. She wouldn't have much time to think because, at that moment, she heard something that made her freeze. Sandra was just about to return to the ballroom when she recognized two familiar voices, Eleanor and Vivian. They stood near the side entrance, speaking softly but excitedly. She had no interest in listening until one name caught her attention: Keanu Reeves. Sandra's heart sped up. What did he have to do with them? Vivian laughed, her tone filled with secrecy. Oh, he has a special surprise planned for tonight. I think Sandra will love it. Eleanor smirked. Or maybe not. A chill ran down Sandra's spine. Their tone did not sound positive. She knew something was going on, and for the first time that night, she felt truly uneasy. What did Keanu have to do with this? And what were they planning? As Sandra tried to quietly distance herself from the criticism, she inadvertently overheard one of the women mention Keanu Reeves's name in a conspiratorial tone, hinting that he had a special surprise planned for the night. Sandra returned to the ballroom without rushing. She already knew exactly what kind of people she was dealing with. Eleanor and Vivian were nothing new, women who thrived on status and believed exclusivity meant exclusion. It was ridiculous. And the funniest part? They actually believed she cared. She grabbed a canopy from a passing tray and kept walking, ignoring the forced silence around her. From across the room, Vivian was watching. She leaned toward Eleanor, whispering something, making sure Sandra saw her smirk. Sandra rolled her eyes internally. The whole thing was straight out of a bad high school movie, two grown, wealthy women acting like teenagers, playing a game of social exclusion. It was laughable. Sandra took another sip of her wine and decided to flip the game. She looked directly at Vivian and smiled. A genuine, effortless smile. Vivian looked caught off guard. She had been expecting discomfort. Instead, Sandra lifted her glass in a silent toast before taking another sip. Vivian's face stiffened. She didn't like losing control, and at that moment, she realized she had zero. Her power over Sandra? Gone. Sandra spotted a familiar face, Michael Whitmore, a well-known actor, philanthropist, and one of the few people who actually seemed to care about more than just status. She thought about going over to him, but then something made her stop. Michael was talking to Vivian, and he was listening. Vivian leaned in, speaking softly, her expression controlled, and Michael nodded, seeming convinced. Sandra didn't feel angry, but she did feel disappointed. Michael was smart enough to know that these women lived for manipulation. If he was listening and considering what she was saying, then maybe he wasn't as trustworthy as he appeared. A shame, but not a surprise. Sandra returned to her table and absent-mindedly played with her fork. She could feel the glances on her, the hushed whispers, but none of it bothered her. In fact, it was entertaining. These people took themselves way too seriously, as if this ballroom was the center of the universe and a single dress choice was an unforgivable offense. Ridiculous. She ate a bite of her meal, wondering how much longer she would have to sit through this whole production. A woman from the next table, visibly uncomfortable, finally spoke up. "Sandra, can I ask you something?" Sandra lifted her eyes. "Of course." The woman hesitated. "I heard some people saying that maybe you're only here because of Keanu." Sandra let out a small laugh. "Eleanor and Vivian, right?" The woman looked a little embarrassed but nodded. Sandra rested her elbow on the table and looked her straight in the eye. "Tell me, do you really believe Keanu needs to invite someone just out of pity?" The woman blinked, unsure. I don't know." Sandra smirked. "Sure, you do. But it's easier to pretend you don't." The woman flushed and looked away. Sandra took another sip of her wine. The silence at the table was delicious. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. Dinner was winding down. Keanu Reeves would soon take the stage for the big announcement of the night. Sandra knew he had no idea what had been happening behind the scenes. But she also knew one thing. The moment Keanu took the microphone, everything would change. Because Keanu didn't play these ridiculous social games. Eleanor and Vivian thought they had power, but Keanu had respect, and that was something they could never buy. Sandra glanced toward the stage. The fun was just beginning. Sandra noticed a possible ally talking to one of her critics, but she didn't feel shaken. Instead, she found the whole situation ridiculous. The dinner was ending, and Keanu Reeves was about to take the stage for a major announcement. Dinner was coming to an end, and all eyes turned toward the stage. A host stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Before we close, we have the honor of inviting the man who made this event possible. Please welcome Keanu Reeves." The room erupted in applause. Sandra crossed her arms and finished her last sip of wine. Finally, the moment had arrived. Eleanor and Vivian were completely focused, as if expecting something spectacular. Sandra, on the other hand, was simply curious. After all, what exactly was this surprise Keanu had planned? Keanu walked onto the stage with his usual relaxed demeanor. He took the microphone, waited for the room to quiet down, and began. "First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. This cause means a lot to me, and seeing so many people come together to support it is truly incredible." The audience applauded again. Keanu continued. "Many of you are familiar with the work this organization does. But tonight, I want to talk about someone very special, someone whose dedication and impact often go unnoticed but deserve to be recognized." Sandra raised an eyebrow. She was not expecting this. This person has contributed immensely to charitable causes and never needed the spotlight to make a difference. Keanu smiled. "I'm talking about Sandra Bullock." For a second, the entire ballroom fell silent. Then, applause spread through the room. Sandra remained calm, but inside, she was amused. She glanced discreetly toward Eleanor and Vivian's table. Both women looked stunned, the exact opposite of what they had anticipated. Keanu continued. "What many of you may not know is that Sandra has been one of the biggest donors and supporters of this cause. She has contributed financially and has also been actively involved in ensuring these projects reach further than we ever imagined." The applause grew louder. Sandra smiled, but not out of vanity. She just loved seeing the shock on certain people's faces. Eleanor tried to mask her discomfort, but Vivian looked furious. They had spent the entire night trying to belittle her, and now Keanu was placing her at the center of recognition. Their plan had backfired. Spectacularly. Vivian whispered something to Eleanor. Eleanor's response came quickly, her voice tense. Sandra observed them, enjoying every second. The two didn't know how to react. Keanu was publicly praising the one person they had tried to diminish. The universe had a perfect sense of humor. Keanu paused, then turned directly to Sandra. Sandra, if you would, I'd love for you to come up here. The crowd applauded again. Sandra exhaled subtly and smiled. For a brief moment, she considered declining, but then she saw Vivian and Eleanor's faces. That mix of shock and frustration. Irresistible, she placed her glass on the table and stood up calmly. She walked through the ballroom with poise, with confidence, and every step felt like a quiet victory. She stepped onto the stage, standing beside Keanu, who smiled warmly. Thank you, Keanu. Keanu handed her the microphone. The stage is yours. Sandra scanned the audience. She hadn't prepared a speech, but she didn't need one. I find it amusing how people assume that doing good things means seeking recognition. I've never cared about being in the spotlight because, to me, helping is something you do, not something you showcase. A murmur spread through the room. She continued, and tonight, being here and receiving this recognition is unexpected but meaningful because it reminds me that, in the end, what truly matters isn't how we look, but the impact we leave in the world. Some guests looked down, embarrassed. Eleanor and Vivian sat completely still. The weight of those words fell directly onto them. Sandra finished her speech with a small, knowing smile. The room burst into applause. She handed the microphone back to Keanu and walked off the stage at her own pace. As she passed Eleanor and Vivian's table, she made sure to stop for just a second. She looked at both of them, tilted her head slightly, and said in a smooth, quiet tone, "I hope you enjoy dinner." Then, she walked away. Neither of them said a single word. Vivian clutched her wine glass so tightly it looked like it might shatter. Eleanor forced a tight-lipped smile, but she was clearly defeated. Sandra returned to her seat and picked up the glass she had left behind. She took a slow sip, crossed her legs, and smiled to herself. The night had finally been worth it. As the audience continued clapping and the event moved toward its conclusion, Sandra noticed something. Vivian leaned toward Eleanor and whispered something. Sandra couldn't hear it, but she saw Eleanor's expression shift to something more uneasy. Something wasn't right. After everything, what else could they possibly be plotting? After Keanu's public revelation, as the audience applauded Sandra, one of the critics exchanged a worried look with her companion, whispering something inaudible. The ballroom was still full, but the atmosphere had completely changed. After Keanu's unexpected tribute, people had started to see Sandra differently. Those who had ignored her earlier now seemed eager to approach her, exchange words, rebuild connections they hadn't even bothered to form before. She saw their surprised expressions, their suddenly wider smiles, their attempts to start conversations as if the past few hours hadn't happened. But Sandra wasn't naive. She knew exactly what was going on. They hadn't changed. They had simply realized they were wrong and didn't want to be on the losing side. That didn't bother her, but it didn't impress her either. Vivian and Eleanor remained seated, but they had lost their earlier confidence. Vivian still held her wine glass, but she was no longer smiling. Eleanor, always composed, tried to mask her discomfort, but it was obvious. They had lost everything they had spent the night building. The exclusion, the whispers, the calculated looks had crumbled in minutes. And the worst part? They had done it to themselves. The truth was simple. They had tried to use appearances as power, but in the end, appearances mean nothing when the truth comes out. Sandra had no interest in wasting time with them, but as she passed their table, she overheard Eleanor's whisper. She can pretend she doesn't care, but deep down, she just wants acceptance like everyone else. Sandra stopped. She turned slowly, pulled out a chair, and sat down beside them. Crossing her legs, she picked up her wine glass and took a slow sip before responding. "Eleanor, if I wanted acceptance from people like you, I would have shown up covered in diamonds just to be worthy of this room, don't you think?" Eleanor's face stiffened. Vivian looked away. Sandra continued, The truth is, you spent the entire night trying to bring me down because you believe status is measured by what you wear or who you socialize with. But if tonight proved anything, it's that what really matters can't be bought. Eleanor forced a thin smile. You're overreacting. This event has always been for people of our world. Sandra tilted her head slightly. And you really think you're at the top, don't you? But look around. Who do you think people actually respect right now? Because from what I see, it's not you. She locked eyes with Eleanor. And the funniest part? You did this to yourselves. If you had treated me like any other guest, you could have avoided this entire embarrassment. Silence. Vivian seemed ready to say something, but she knew there was nothing left to say. Sandra simply smiled, unbothered. Good luck fixing this. She stood up and walked away. Eleanor and Vivian stayed silent. This time, they knew they had lost. Sandra walked over to Keanu, who had been watching from a distance. He lifted his glass toward her. Well played. Sandra smiled and clinked her glass with his. If they think they can take me down with gossip, they're seriously underestimating my patience. Keanu chuckled. You know what I find funny? How people cling so tightly to this idea of status as if it actually means something in the grand scheme of things. Sandra nodded. She glanced around the room. I saw so many people change their attitude after your speech, as if a public tribute from someone important suddenly determined my worth. Keanu exhaled. People need external validation to decide who deserves respect, but real respect doesn't need validation. Sandra turned to him. And that's why you've never played this game. You never cared about this whole performance. Keanu smirked. And that's why you never did either. I guess that's why we've always gotten along. Sandra laughed. Do you think people will remember this night? Keanu shrugged. Maybe some will. But most will go on believing that status and wealth are all that matter. Sandra looked toward Eleanor and Vivian. Neither of them were smiling anymore. And others will remember it forever. Keanu nodded. Yeah, some will. Sandra and Keanu walked out of the ballroom together. Before getting into the car, Sandra took one last glance at the event that had started with so many false appearances and ended with undeniable truths. She turned to Keanu and smiled. I think we learned something tonight. Keanu raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Sandra opened the car door but paused before getting in. She looked at him one last time and said, It doesn't matter what you wear, who you associate with, or what people think of you. She smiled. The only thing that truly matters is who you are when no one is watching. Keanu returned her smile. And you've always known that. Sandra stepped into the car, and Keanu watched as she drove away. The event was over, but the lesson from that night would last far longer. If this story kept you hooked, you're in for more. Dive into a world of unforgettable tales filled with hope, compassion, and resilience. Click the screen and let the next story take you on a journey you won't forget.